Have you ever looked at an old family photograph and felt something was terribly wrong? What if I told you that sometimes the most respectable families hide the darkest secrets behind their perfect smiles? Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will make you question everything you think you know about power, silence, and the price of keeping family secrets. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that will leave you speechless. The autumn of 1923 brought an unusual chill to Magnolia County, Georgia. The Fairburn mansion stood like a monument to Southern prosperity, its white columns gleaming against the backdrop of golden oak trees. But inside those pristine walls, a question lingered in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Why do all the children look like the slave? Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had whispered it to her husband during the Fairburns' annual harvest dinner, her fan fluttering nervously as she glanced toward the dining room where the family's portrait hung in gilded splendor. The painting showed Cornelius Fairburn, patriarch and cotton plantation owner, standing proudly behind his wife Margaret and their 4 children, Thomas, 16, Elizabeth, 14, James, 12, and little Sarah, 8. But it wasn't the family that drew uncomfortable stares. It was the uncanny resemblance between the children and Miriam, the 28-year-old house servant who moved silently through the mansion's corridors like a ghost in calico dress. The formal family photograph that had been taken just months earlier told a story that no one dared to speak aloud. In that sepia-toned image, the family was arranged with military precision in their opulent parlor. Heavy velvet curtains framed tall windows, and ornate furniture spoke of wealth accumulated through generations of cotton profits. Oil paintings of stern ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their eyes seeming to judge the living from beyond the grave. In the photograph, Cornelius stood with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his hand resting possessively on the back of an ornate chair. Margaret sat rigidly beside him, her elaborate dress a testament to their social standing, her face composed in the serious expression demanded by the long exposure times of early photography. The children were arranged around them like precious ornaments, Thomas tall and serious in his young man's suit, Elizabeth demure in white lace, James fidgeting despite his mother's stern warnings to remain still, and little Sarah clutching a porcelain doll that cost more than most families earned in a year. But it was the background figures that made visitors uncomfortable. There, standing slightly apart from the family group, were the household servants, and among them Miriam stood out like a living contradiction to everything the photograph was meant to represent. Her simple dark dress and white apron marked her station, but her bearing was that of someone who belonged in the scene rather than merely serving it. Her face, captured in that moment of stillness, held an expression that was neither subservient nor defiant. It was the look of someone keeping a profound secret. The resemblance was impossible to ignore once you knew to look for it. Thomas had inherited Miriam's strong jawline and the way she held her head when listening intently. Elizabeth's graceful hands were mirror images of Miriam's as she arranged flowers or served tea. James had the same stubborn cowlick that Miriam tried to hide beneath her head wrap, and his laugh, when he forgot himself, carried the same musical quality as hers. Even little Sarah, with her golden curls so different from Miriam's dark hair, had inherited the woman's expressive eyes and the way she tilted her head when concentrating. Miriam had worked for the Fairburns since she was 14, brought from a neighboring plantation when her previous master died. She was beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable, high cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes, and skin the color of café au lait. But it was her silence that unnerved visitors most. She never spoke unless spoken to, never met anyone's gaze directly, and seemed to anticipate the family's needs before they voiced them. The other servants whispered about her sometimes, in the brief moments when they gathered in the kitchen or the laundry. They spoke of how she could read and write, unusual for someone in her position. How she sometimes hummed melodies that sounded like lullabies when she thought no one was listening. How her eyes would follow the children with an intensity that went beyond mere professional care. But these whispers never reached the main house. The servants knew better than to voice such dangerous observations. "Mama, why does everyone stare at Miriam when they visit?" young Sarah had asked her mother one evening as Margaret brushed her golden curls. Margaret's hand had frozen mid-stroke. "Don't ask such questions, darling. It's not proper for young ladies to concern themselves with the help." But Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed. Thomas, now old enough to understand the weight of whispered conversations, had begun to see what others saw. The way Miriam's eyes held the same deep brown as his own. How her hands, when she served dinner, moved with the same graceful precision as Elizabeth's when she played piano. The stubborn cowlick in James's hair that matched the one Miriam tried to hide beneath her head wrap. The resemblance was becoming impossible to ignore, and Cornelius Fairburn knew it. He had begun to notice the way conversations stopped when he entered rooms, the meaningful glances exchanged between his guests, the careful way people phrased their compliments about his children. The social fabric of their community was built on unspoken agreements and willful blindness to certain truths. But even that fabric had its limits. That October evening, as the last dinner guests departed, Cornelius stood in his study, brandy in hand, staring at the family portrait. His wife Margaret entered quietly, her silk dress rustling against the hardwood floor. "The Whitmores were asking questions again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cornelius didn't turn around. "What kind of questions?" "The kind we can't answer without destroying everything we've built." He finally faced her, his weathered features hard as granite. "Then we don't answer them. We never have, and we never will." But Margaret's hands trembled as she clasped them together. "Cornelius, she's been with us for 14 years. The children, they're growing up. People aren't blind. People see what they want to see," he replied firmly. "And they'll keep their mouths shut if they know what's good for them." The weight of their secret had grown heavier with each passing year. What had begun as a desperate solution to an impossible situation had evolved into an elaborate deception that required constant vigilance to maintain. Every social gathering was a minefield of potential exposure. Every new visitor to their home was a threat to the carefully constructed narrative of their lives. Outside the study door, Miriam paused in her evening duties, a silver tray balanced in her hands. She had learned long ago to move like a shadow, to hear without being seen. The conversation inside made her heart race. But her face remained impassive. She had perfected the art of invisibility. It was the only way she had survived this long. As she continued down the hallway, Miriam caught her reflection in the ornate mirror that hung near the staircase. For just a moment, she allowed herself to really look, to see what everyone else saw. The resemblance was undeniable, written in every feature, every gesture, every unconscious mannerism the children had inherited. She thought of Thomas, who had started looking at her with curious, questioning eyes. Of Elizabeth, who sometimes hummed the same lullabies Miriam sang while working. Of James, whose laugh echoed her own in ways that made her chest ache. And little Sarah, who had her mother's golden hair but Miriam's expressive eyes. The truth was a living thing in that house, growing stronger each day, threatening to burst from the careful silence that contained it. And Miriam knew that soon, very soon, someone would have the courage to speak the words that would change everything. That night, as she prepared for bed in her small room behind the kitchen, Miriam pulled out a wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were 4 small items, a lock of dark hair from each child, collected over the years from their hairbrushes. She had told herself it was foolish sentiment, but now she understood it was something deeper. A mother's desperate need to hold on to pieces of the children she could never claim. The autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out into the darkness. Change was coming to the Fairburn mansion, whether they were ready for it or not. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Magnolia County in an unusual layer of snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something foreign and unsettling. Inside the Fairburn mansion, the cold seemed to seep through more than just the walls. It settled into the very bones of the house, making every conversation feel brittle and every silence heavy with unspoken truths. The snow had trapped them all inside for days, creating an enforced intimacy that made the careful choreography of their daily lives increasingly difficult to maintain. Without the buffer of social obligations and outdoor activities, the family found themselves in closer quarters than usual, and the resemblances that had always been there became impossible to ignore. Thomas had begun to notice things he'd never paid attention to before. The way his father's jaw tightened whenever visitors lingered too long in Miriam's presence. How his mother would suddenly find urgent tasks for Miriam in distant parts of the house when company arrived. The careful choreography of a family trying to hide something in plain sight. But it was more than just the obvious physical similarities that troubled him. There were moments, fleeting instances that he was only now beginning to recognize, when Miriam's mask would slip. When little Sarah scraped her knee in the garden, it was Miriam who had rushed to her aid with the instinctive urgency of a mother, not a servant. When James had fallen ill with fever the previous winter, Thomas had seen Miriam sitting outside his bedroom door through the long night, her face etched with worry that went far beyond professional concern. The formal portrait that hung in their parlor had become a source of fascination and dread for Thomas. He found himself studying it during the long winter evenings, searching for clues he had missed before. The way Miriam stood slightly apart from the other servants, her posture suggesting she belonged somewhere else in the composition. The careful positioning that kept her in the background but still visible, as if whoever had arranged the photograph couldn't bear to exclude her entirely, but dared not place her where she truly belonged. The other servants in the photograph seemed to fade into the background, their faces showing the practiced invisibility of those accustomed to being overlooked. But Miriam's presence commanded attention despite her position. There was something in her eyes, a depth of emotion that spoke of connections beyond the professional relationship between employer and employee. It was during a particularly harsh February storm that everything began to unravel. The family had gathered in the parlor after dinner, as was their custom. Margaret played piano while Elizabeth sang. James worked on his arithmetic, and Sarah played with her porcelain dolls. Cornelius read his newspaper by the fire, and Miriam moved quietly about the room, collecting teacups and straightening cushions. The storm outside had knocked out the telephone lines and made the roads impassable, creating a sense of isolation that seemed to press against the windows like a living thing. The wind howled through the eaves, and the old house creaked and settled around them, as if the very structure was struggling to contain the secrets within its walls. "Miriam!" Sarah called out suddenly, her young voice cutting through the domestic tranquility. "Come sit with us. You look tired." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. Margaret's hands froze above the piano keys. Cornelius lowered his newspaper slowly, his eyes fixed on his youngest daughter. "Sarah," Margaret said carefully, "Miriam has work to do." "But she's always working," Sarah protested, her 8-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of things. "And she looks sad." "Don't you get sad, Miriam?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the established order of their household. For 14 years, Miriam had been treated as a fixture of the house, present but not truly seen, essential but not acknowledged. Sarah's innocent observation forced everyone in the room to confront the humanity they had all been carefully ignoring. Miriam stood frozen, the empty teacups trembling slightly in her hands. For 14 years, she had perfected the art of being invisible, of existing in the spaces between the family's life without ever truly being part of it. But Sarah's innocent question had suddenly made her visible in a way that terrified everyone in the room. "I'm fine, Miss Sarah," Miriam said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for your kindness." But her voice betrayed her. There was a tremor there, a crack in the careful composure she had maintained for so long. Thomas heard it, and he saw the way her hands shook as she set down the teacups. He saw the tears she was fighting to hold back, and something inside him shifted irrevocably. Thomas watched this exchange with growing unease. There was something in Miriam's voice, a gentleness, a warmth that seemed familiar in a way he couldn't place. And when she looked at Sarah, just for a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing something that made his chest tighten with recognition. The resemblance wasn't just physical, he realized. It was in the way Miriam's face softened when she looked at any of them. It was in the protective instinct that made her step forward whenever one of them was in distress. It was in the way she knew exactly how each of them liked their tea, which books they preferred, what songs comforted them when they were upset. "Father," Thomas said suddenly, surprising himself with his boldness, "why don't we know anything about Miriam's family? Where she came from before she worked for us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cornelius set down his newspaper with deliberate precision, his movements controlled but his eyes flashing with warning. "That's not our concern, son. Miriam's past is her own business." "But surely she has family somewhere," Thomas pressed, ignoring his mother's sharp intake of breath. "Parents, siblings, don't you miss them, Miriam?" The question was cruel in its innocence, and Thomas saw Miriam flinch as if he had struck her. Her past was not her own. It belonged to the people who had owned her, shaped by forces beyond her control. The family she might have had, the life she might have lived, had been sacrificed to the brutal mathematics of slavery and the complex negotiations of survival. Miriam's hands had begun to shake visibly now. She set the teacups down on a side table, her movements careful and measured despite her obvious distress. I should finish in the kitchen," she whispered, moving toward the door. "Wait," Elizabeth said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. She had been watching the exchange with the keen observation of a 14-year-old girl beginning to understand the complexities of the adult world. "Miriam, you've been with us since I was little. You're like family." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Margaret rose from the piano bench so quickly that the sheet music scattered to the floor. Cornelius stood as well, his face flushed with anger and something that looked dangerously close to panic. Elizabeth's words had given voice to what they had all felt but never dared to acknowledge. The bonds that connected Miriam to their family went far deeper than employment or even affection. They were the bonds of blood, of shared history, of love that had been forced into hiding but had never truly disappeared. "Elizabeth, that's enough," he said sharply. "Miriam, you're dismissed for the evening." But Miriam didn't move. For the first time in 14 years, she stood her ground, looking directly at the man who had controlled every aspect of her life since she was barely more than a child herself. The moment stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken truths and carefully maintained lies. In that silence, the weight of their shared history pressed down on everyone in the room. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. "Mr. Fairburn," she said, her voice stronger now. "Perhaps it's time." "I said you're dismissed," Cornelius interrupted, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority and barely contained rage. Miriam's eyes swept across the room, taking in each face. Margaret's pale terror, Elizabeth's confused concern, James's wide-eyed curiosity, Sarah's innocent confusion, and Thomas's growing understanding. When her gaze finally returned to Cornelius, there was something new there, a quiet defiance that had been building for 14 years. "Yes, sir," she said finally, but her tone carried a subtle challenge that everyone in the room heard. After she left, the family sat in stunned silence. The fire continued to crackle, the wind continued to howl outside, but something fundamental had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The careful balance they had maintained for so long was beginning to crumble, and everyone could feel it. "Father," Thomas said quietly, "what aren't you telling us?" Cornelius turned to face his eldest son, and for a moment Thomas saw something he'd never seen before in his father's eyes: fear. "Some things are better left unspoken, son. Some truths are too dangerous to voice." "Dangerous to whom?" Thomas asked, his voice gaining strength, but Cornelius had already turned away, staring into the fire as if it held answers to questions he couldn't bear to ask. That night, as the storm raged outside, each member of the Fairburn family lay awake in their beds, wrestling with thoughts they'd never allowed themselves to think. And in her small room behind the kitchen, Miriam sat by her window, watching the snow fall and wondering if she finally had the courage to speak the truth that had been burning inside her for 14 years. The silence that had protected them all was beginning to crack, and everyone in the house could feel it. Spring came late to Magnolia County in 1924, as if the earth itself was reluctant to shed the protective blanket of winter. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it a restlessness that seemed to infect everyone in the Fairburn mansion. The carefully maintained routines that had governed their lives for so long began to feel suffocating, and the unspoken questions that had simmered beneath the surface all winter finally demanded answers. The thaw had revealed damage from the harsh winter, loose shingles, water stains, and structural problems that required immediate attention. It was this necessity that led to Thomas's presence in the attic on that fateful April morning, helping his father assess what repairs would be needed before the next winter arrived. The attic was a repository of family history, filled with trunks of old clothes, boxes of documents, and furniture that had been relegated to storage when newer pieces arrived. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through the small windows, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten memories. It was Thomas who made the discovery that would change everything. He had been helping his father organize old business papers in the attic when he noticed a loose floorboard near the far corner of the room. The board had been disturbed by the winter's freeze and thaw cycle, creating a gap that hadn't been there before. Curiosity got the better of him, and when Cornelius left to take a telephone call downstairs, Thomas pried up the board to reveal a small space beneath. The hiding place had been carefully constructed, lined with oilcloth to protect its contents from moisture and time. Inside was a wooden box, similar to the one Miriam kept hidden in her room, though Thomas had no way of knowing that. His hands trembled as he lifted it out and carefully opened the lid. What he found inside made his world tilt on its axis. There were letters, dozens of them, written in his father's distinctive handwriting. But these weren't business correspondence or family letters. These were love letters, passionate and desperate, addressed to my dearest M. The dates went back 15 years, starting when Thomas was just a baby. The paper was expensive, the kind Cornelius used for important business correspondence, but the words written on it spoke of emotions that had no place in the formal world of cotton trading and plantation management. The ink had faded slightly with age, but the passion behind the words remained vivid and immediate. With growing horror and fascination, Thomas read words that revealed a side of his father he'd never imagined. "My dearest M, I cannot sleep for thinking of you. This arrangement we have, It tears at my soul, but I am a coward, and I cannot find the strength to change what society demands of us. You are more to me than duty, more than reputation, more than the life I was born to live. Yet I am trapped by the very privileges that separate us." The letter went on to describe stolen moments, secret meetings, and a love that defied every social convention of their time. Cornelius wrote of watching Miriam with the children, of seeing her natural maternal instincts suppressed by the roles they were forced to play. He wrote of his guilt, his shame, and his desperate love for a woman he could never publicly acknowledge. Another letter, dated 2 years later: "The child grows more beautiful each day, and I see you in every gesture, every smile. Margaret suspects nothing, but I fear the day when the resemblance becomes too obvious to ignore. What have we done, my love? What legacy are we creating for these innocent souls?" Thomas's hands shook as he continued reading. The pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed falling into place with devastating clarity. The letters spoke of secret meetings in the old carriage house, of conversations that lasted deep into the night, of a relationship that had produced not just one child, but all 4 of them. There were practical letters, too, discussing the elaborate deceptions required to maintain their secret. Cornelius wrote about the arrangements made for each birth, the careful timing of Margaret's supposed pregnancies, the network of trusted servants and discreet doctors who had helped maintain the illusion. He wrote about the financial provisions he had made for Miriam, the legal documents that would protect her if anything happened to him, the constant fear that their secret would be discovered. But it was the emotional letters that cut deepest. In them, Cornelius revealed himself as a man torn between love and duty, between his genuine feelings for Miriam and the social expectations that governed his life. He wrote of watching his children grow up, knowing they were his, but unable to claim them fully. He wrote of the pain of seeing Miriam relegated to the role of servant when she deserved so much more. The final letter was dated just 6 months ago. "I know you grow weary of this charade, as do I. But what choice do we have? To acknowledge the truth would destroy not just us, but them. They are innocent of our sins, yet they would bear the burden of society's judgment. I am a selfish man, Em, and I choose their future over our truth. Can you forgive me for being too weak to be the man you deserve?" Thomas sat back on his heels, the letters scattered around him like evidence of a crime. Everything made sense now, the resemblances, the whispered conversations, the careful way his parents managed Miriam's presence in their lives. She wasn't just their servant, she was. The sound of footsteps on the attic stairs made him look up in panic. He began gathering the letters frantically, but it was too late. "Thomas!" He spun around to find his father standing at the top of the attic stairs, his face pale as he took in the scene before him. "Father, I put those away," Cornelius said quietly, but his voice carried a weariness that Thomas had never heard before. "I can't," Thomas said, surprising himself with his firmness. "Not now that I know." Cornelius climbed the rest of the way into the attic and sat heavily on an old trunk, suddenly looking every one of his 53 years. The confident patriarch who had dominated Thomas's childhood seemed to have aged decades in the space of a few moments. "What do you think you know?" he asked. "I know that Miriam isn't just our servant," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength. "I know that you, that she, that we—" He struggled to find words for a truth so enormous it seemed to defy language. "That she's your mother," Cornelius finished quietly. "That all of you are her children as much as you are Margaret's." The words hung in the dusty air between them, finally spoken after years of careful silence. Thomas felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him, as if everything he had believed about his life had been revealed as an elaborate fiction. "How?" Thomas whispered. Cornelius was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with years of guilt and regret. I was 25 when Miriam came to work for us. Margaret and I had been married for 2 years, but she had difficulty carrying children to term. We had lost 3 babies, and the doctors said it was unlikely she would ever successfully bear a child. He paused, lost in memories that clearly still caused him pain. The attic around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls were listening to this long-overdue confession. Miriam was so young, so beautiful, so intelligent. She could read and write, which was unusual for someone in her position. We would talk sometimes. Late at night when she was finishing her duties and I was working in my study, she had thoughts about books, about the world beyond this county. She made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Thomas listened in stunned silence as his father continued, painting a picture of a relationship that had begun in loneliness and grown into something that defied the social order of their world. It began innocently enough. Conversations, then friendship, then something deeper. I told myself it was love, but I was her master and she was my property. How could there be love in such an arrangement? Yet she seemed to care for me as well. And when she became pregnant with you let everyone believe I was mother's child, Thomas said. Margaret was desperate for a child. When Miriam began to show, we sent her away for several months, claiming she was visiting family. Margaret wore padding, told everyone she was finally expecting. When you were born, we brought you home as our own, and Miriam returned as your wet nurse, then simply stayed on as help. The elaborate deception was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Thomas tried to imagine the planning required, the careful coordination of lies, the constant vigilance needed to maintain such a massive fraud. And the others? Each time the same deception. Margaret grew to love you all as her own. She truly did. But she knew the truth and it ate at her. The guilt, the constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that she was raising another woman's children while that woman served in her house. Thomas felt sick. The weight of the deception, the cruelty of forcing Miriam to watch her children grow up while pretending to be nothing more than a servant, the psychological toll on everyone involved. It was almost too much to comprehend. Does she know that we know? She's always known that someday the truth would come out. She's been waiting for it, I think, dreading it and hoping for it at the same time. The complexity of Miriam's position struck Thomas with full force. She had been trapped in a role that denied her most basic maternal instincts, forced to love her children from a distance while watching another woman receive the credit for raising them. The strength it must have taken to endure such a situation for 14 years was almost incomprehensible. "What happens now?" Thomas asked. Cornelius looked at his son, Miriam's son, with eyes full of pain and love and regret. "Now you have to decide what kind of man you want to be, whether you'll help us continue this lie, or whether you'll have the courage that I never had to speak the truth." Downstairs, the rest of the family was going about their evening routines, unaware that their world was about to change forever. And in the kitchen, Miriam was preparing dinner, her hands steady, despite the fact that she had heard every word of the conversation above through the old house's thin walls. The truth was finally free, and there would be no putting it back. The confrontation came 3 days later, on a warm April evening, when the magnolia trees were in full bloom and the air was heavy with the promise of change. The sweet fragrance of the blossoms drifted through the open windows of the Fairburn mansion, a stark contrast to the tension that had been building within its walls since Thomas's discovery in the attic. Thomas had spent those 3 days wrestling with the weight of what he'd learned, watching his family with new eyes. Every interaction took on new meaning. Every gesture revealed layers of deception he had never noticed before. He saw how Margaret's hands trembled when she served tea, how she avoided looking directly at any of her children. He noticed the way Miriam moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes holding a mixture of hope and terror. He observed his father's increasing agitation, the way Cornelius jumped at every unexpected sound, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. The formal family portrait in the parlor had become a source of particular fascination for Thomas. He found himself studying it obsessively, seeing it now as a document of deception rather than a celebration of family unity. The careful positioning of each figure, the way Miriam had been placed just far enough in the background to maintain the illusion while still being present. It all spoke to the elaborate choreography required to maintain their lie. He had tried to approach his siblings individually, testing the waters to see if any of them suspected the truth. Elizabeth had always been perceptive, and he caught her watching Miriam with new intensity, as if she too was beginning to piece together the puzzle. James seemed oblivious, caught up in the typical concerns of a 12-year-old boy, but even he had begun to notice the strange atmosphere in the house. And Sarah, with the innocent directness of childhood, continued to ask the uncomfortable questions that no one wanted to answer. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine family dinner. The dining room was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, the table set with the finest china and crystal that spoke of the family's wealth and status. The meal had proceeded normally at first, with polite conversation about the day's activities and plans for the upcoming week. But it was Sarah who forced the issue. As children often do with their innocent directness, the family had gathered for dinner, the dining room filled with the soft glow of candlelight and the gentle clink of silverware against china. Miriam was serving the evening meal, moving silently around the table as she had for 14 years. "Miriam," Sarah said suddenly, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the polite dinner conversation. "Why don't you ever eat with us?" Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. Cornelius's face went rigid. The question hung in the air like an accusation, innocent in its delivery, but devastating in its implications. "Sarah, we've discussed this," Margaret said carefully, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining normalcy. "Miriam has her own meals in the kitchen." "But that seems lonely," Sarah persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "And she's part of our family, isn't she? Thomas said so the other day." All eyes turned to Thomas, who felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The candlelight flickered across the faces around the table, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the uncertainty in the room. He looked around the table, at Elizabeth and James, who were watching with growing confusion, at his parents, whose faces were masks of barely controlled panic, at Miriam, who had frozen in place beside the sideboard, a serving dish trembling in her hands. The moment stretched endlessly, heavy with the weight of 14 years of carefully maintained deception. Thomas could feel the truth pressing against his chest, demanding to be spoken. He thought of the letters hidden in the attic, of the pain he had seen in his father's words, of the impossible situation that had trapped them all in a web of lies. "Yes," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "She is part of our family." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face had gone white as the tablecloth. Cornelius half rose from his chair, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Elizabeth's eyes widened with sudden understanding, while James looked confused and frightened by the sudden tension in the room. The formal portrait on the wall seemed to watch over the scene, its subjects frozen in their careful poses, while the living family below struggled with the truth that the photograph had hidden for so long. The contrast was stark, the artificial perfection of the painted image versus the raw, messy reality of human emotion and family secrets. It was Miriam who broke the silence. "Perhaps," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's time they knew." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Miriam set down the serving dish with careful precision, her movements deliberate despite the trembling in her hands. "Miriam, no," Margaret breathed, but there was no real protest in her voice, only the exhausted resignation of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for too long. Miriam turned to face the children she had watched grow up, the children she had loved from a distance for their entire lives. The candlelight caught the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes, but her voice grew stronger with each word. "Your father is right," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am part of this family. I am your mother." Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. James's eyes went wide with shock and confusion. Sarah looked between Miriam and Margaret, her young mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "But Mama is our mother," Sarah said, pointing to Margaret with the simple logic of childhood. "Mrs. Margaret has been a wonderful mother to you," Miriam said gently, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "She has loved you and cared for you and raised you as her own. But I gave birth to each of you. I'm the reason you have my eyes, my hands, my stubborn cowlick." She reached out tentatively toward James, who sat frozen in his chair. The revelation hung in the air between them, transforming everything they thought they knew about their family, their identity, their place in the world. The careful social order that had governed their lives was crumbling before their eyes, replaced by a truth that was both liberating and terrifying. "This is impossible," Elizabeth whispered. But even as she said it, Thomas could see the recognition dawning in her eyes, the same recognition he had felt when reading those letters. The physical resemblances that had always been there suddenly made perfect sense. The way Miriam had always seemed to anticipate their needs, the depth of her concern when they were hurt or sick, the careful way she had watched over them while maintaining the pretense of being merely a servant. It all fell into place with devastating clarity. Cornelius finally found his voice. "Children, this situation is complicated. There are things you don't understand about the world, about society." "I understand enough," Thomas interrupted, standing up from his chair. "I understand that for 17 years I've been living a lie. We all have." He turned to Miriam, this woman who had been a constant presence in his life but never truly seen. The formal portrait on the wall seemed to mock them all now, its careful arrangement designed to hide the very truth that was finally being revealed. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you agree to this? Why did you let us grow up not knowing?" Miriam's composure finally cracked, and she sank into the nearest chair, something she had never done in the dining room before. The simple act of sitting at their table was revolutionary, a breaking of the social barriers that had defined her existence for 14 years. "Because I was 14 years old when I came to this house," she said through her tears. "Because I was property, not a person. Because your father was kind to me when others were not, and I mistook kindness for love. Because when you were born, I was told that this was the only way you could have a future, as a Fairburn child, not as the child of a slave." She looked around the table at each of her children, her eyes drinking in their faces, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. "I watched you grow up from the shadows. I celebrated your first steps, your first words, your achievements, but always from a distance. I comforted you when you were sick, but I could never hold you when you cried. I loved you with every fiber of my being, but I could never tell you so." Margaret, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke. "I couldn't have children," she said, her voice hollow with years of suppressed pain. "The doctors said it was impossible. When Cornelius told me about Miriam's pregnancy, I saw it as a gift from God, a chance to be a mother. I never thought I never considered what it would cost her, what it would cost all of us. The complexity of their situation was staggering. Margaret had genuinely loved the children she had raised, but she had also been complicit in denying Miriam her rightful place as their mother. Cornelius had tried to protect everyone, but had ended up hurting them all. And Miriam had sacrificed her own maternal rights for what she believed was her children's best chance at a good life. "So what happens now?" James asked, his 12-year-old voice small and uncertain. It was a question that hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications none of them were fully prepared to face. The social consequences of acknowledging the truth would be severe. The legal implications were unclear. The emotional work of rebuilding their relationships on a foundation of honesty rather than deception would be enormous. Thomas looked around the table at his family. All of his family, including the woman who had just revealed herself as his biological mother. The truth was out now, impossible to take back, and they would all have to live with the consequences. "Now," he said slowly, "we figure out how to be honest, how to be a real family instead of one built on lies." "The scandal will destroy us," Cornelius said quietly. "Society will never accept." "Then maybe it's time society changed," Thomas interrupted. "Maybe it's time someone had the courage to tell the truth, regardless of the cost." He turned to Miriam, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and terror. "I don't know how to call you mother," he said honestly. "I don't know how any of this works, but I know that I'm tired of pretending. We all are." Elizabeth nodded slowly, then James. Even little Sarah, who didn't fully understand the implications, seemed to sense the importance of the moment. "Will you stay?" Elizabeth asked Miriam. "Will you? Will you be our mother now? Really?" Miriam looked around the table at the faces of her children, children who were finally truly hers to claim. "If you'll have me," she whispered. "If you can forgive me for all the years I couldn't be what you needed me to be." "There's nothing to forgive," Thomas said firmly. "You did what you had to do to survive. We all did." Indeed, as the candles burned lower and the evening deepened around them, the Fairburn family began the long, difficult process of learning how to be honest with each other. There would be challenges ahead: social ostracism, legal complications, the need to redefine relationships that had been built on deception. But for the first time in their lives, they were facing those challenges together, as a real family built on truth rather than lies. Outside, the magnolia trees continued to bloom, their white petals falling like snow in the warm spring air, covering the ground with the promise of new beginnings. 1 year later. The photographer adjusted his camera one final time, peering through the lens at the family arranged before him. It was an unusual commission, a family portrait where the former house servant sat prominently among the children, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of the youngest girl. "Hold still now," he called out, preparing to capture the image. The scene before him was unlike any family portrait he had ever been asked to photograph. In an era when social conventions were rigid and racial boundaries carefully maintained, the Fairburn family had chosen to present themselves in a way that defied every expectation of Southern society. Thomas Fairburn, now 18 and preparing for college, stood tall beside his father. The young man had grown into his features over the past year, and the resemblance to Miriam was now unmistakable. He carried himself with a new confidence, the bearing of someone who had found his true identity and was no longer afraid to claim it. Elizabeth, 15 and more confident than she'd ever been, sat gracefully in her chair. The past year had transformed her from a sheltered plantation daughter into a young woman with strong opinions about justice and equality. James, 13 and growing into his features, grinned despite his mother's, Miriam's, gentle reminder to look serious. And Sarah, now 9, beamed with the joy of a child who finally understood why she had always felt such a connection, to the woman who had cared for her since birth. Cornelius and Margaret stood together, their relationship forever changed, but somehow stronger for having survived the truth. Margaret had chosen to stay, to help raise the children she had come to love as her own. Even knowing they would never truly be hers, it was an arrangement that defied social convention. But then their entire family had learned to live beyond the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable. The past year had been difficult for Margaret, as she struggled to redefine her role in the family and come to terms with the deception she had helped maintain. But she had also discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed, and a capacity for love that transcended biological bonds. Miriam sat in the center of the group, no longer hidden in the shadows, no longer forced to love her children from a distance. She wore a simple but elegant dress, not the uniform of a servant, but the clothing of a free woman, a mother, a person with dignity and worth. The transformation in her appearance was remarkable. No longer burdened by the need to remain invisible, she had blossomed into the confident, intelligent woman she had always been beneath the surface. The camera clicked, capturing a moment that would have been impossible just a year before. When the photograph was developed, it would show something revolutionary for its time. A mixed-race family, openly acknowledging their bonds, refusing to hide behind the lies that had once defined them. The scandal had been every bit as devastating as Cornelius had predicted. Many of their former friends had turned away, unable to accept the truth of what the Fairburns had become. Business relationships had suffered. Invitations to social events had stopped coming. The family had been ostracized by much of Magnolia County's white society, their former status as pillars of the community stripped away overnight. But something unexpected had happened as well. Other families had quietly reached out, sharing their own secrets, their own struggles with the rigid expectations of Southern society. A small but growing community of people who were tired of living lies had begun to form around them. Mixed-race families who had been hiding in plain sight found the courage to acknowledge their true relationships. Progressive white families who opposed the racial hierarchy began to associate with the Fairburns openly. Even some members of the black community, initially suspicious of the family's motives, had come to respect their willingness to sacrifice their social standing for the sake of truth. The legal challenges had been complex and ongoing. Miriam's status as a free woman had to be formally established, despite the fact that slavery had been abolished decades earlier. The children's legitimacy was questioned, their inheritance rights challenged. But Thomas had proven to be a formidable advocate for his family, using his education and social connections to navigate the legal system with surprising skill. Thomas had decided to study law, determined to fight for changes in the legal system that would protect families like his own. His experiences had given him a unique perspective on justice and equality, and he was already being courted by progressive organizations that were working to challenge discriminatory laws. Elizabeth had discovered a passion for writing, documenting the stories of people whose voices had been silenced by society's expectations. Her articles about mixed-race families and the legacy of slavery were beginning to appear in northern publications, where they were finding an eager audience among abolitionists and social reformers. James showed promise as a teacher, eager to educate others about the complexity of human relationships and the arbitrary nature of racial categories. His natural empathy and intelligence made him a favorite among the children in the small school that had been established for the mixed-race community that was growing around the Fairburn family. And Sarah, young as she was, had already shown herself to be a fierce defender of anyone she perceived as being treated unfairly. Her innocent questions and observations often cut straight to the heart of social hypocrisies that adults preferred to ignore. As for Miriam, she was learning how to be a mother in the open, how to love her children without fear, how to exist as a full person rather than a shadow. It was harder than she had imagined. Years of suppressing her natural instincts couldn't be undone overnight. But every day brought small victories. A goodnight kiss freely given, a word of advice offered without hesitation, a moment of pride openly expressed. The relationship between Miriam and Margaret had been perhaps the most complex to navigate. Both women had loved the same children, both had made sacrifices for their welfare, both had been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. But they had found a way to coexist, to share the responsibilities of motherhood in a way that honored both their contributions to the children's lives. "Perfect," the photographer said, lowering his camera. "That should do it." As the family relaxed and began to disperse, Thomas lingered for a moment, looking at the spot where they had all stood together. In a few weeks, this photograph would join the others in the family gallery, but unlike those earlier portraits, with their hidden secrets and careful deceptions, this one would tell the truth. He thought about the old family photograph that had started it all, the one that had prompted whispered questions and uncomfortable stares. That portrait still hung in the hallway, but now it served a different purpose. Instead of hiding the truth, it reminded them of how far they had come, of the courage it had taken to choose honesty over comfort, love over convention. The formal arrangement of that earlier photograph now seemed like a relic from another era. The careful positioning that had kept Miriam in the background, the rigid poses that had hidden the family's true relationships, the elaborate costumes that had been designed to reinforce social hierarchies, all of it seemed artificial and cruel in retrospect. "Thomas." Miriam's voice was soft, still tentative in some ways, but growing stronger each day. He turned to find her standing nearby, her expression uncertain but hopeful. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for having the courage to speak the truth when I couldn't, for giving us all the chance to be a real family." Thomas smiled, and for the first time he reached out and took her hand, not as a son taking comfort from a servant, but as a young man acknowledging the woman who had given him life. "Thank you," he said, "for waiting for us to be ready to hear it." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's laughter as she chased James through the garden. Their joy infectious and uncomplicated. Elizabeth sat on the porch steps, writing in her journal, documenting this moment for posterity. Margaret and Cornelius stood together on the veranda, watching their unconventional family with expressions of wonder and gratitude. Outside, the magnolia trees were blooming again, their white petals drifting on the warm spring breeze. But this time, the family watching from the windows wasn't afraid of what the changing seasons might bring. They had learned that truth, however painful, was always preferable to the most beautiful lie. And in the years to come, when other families faced similar crossroads, when other children asked uncomfortable questions about resemblances that couldn't be explained away, they would point to the Fairburns as proof that love could triumph over convention, that families could be built on truth rather than deception, and that sometimes the most radical act of all was simply refusing to live a lie. The photograph would become more than just a family portrait. It would become a symbol of change, a testament to the power of speaking truth in a world built on silence, and a reminder that the most important inheritance parents can leave their children is not wealth or status, but the courage to live authentically. In the end, the question that had haunted the Fairburn mansion for so many years, "Why do all the children look like the slave?" had been answered not with shame or denial, but with love, acceptance, and the revolutionary idea that family is defined not by society's rules, but by the bonds of the heart. The formal portrait that had once hidden their secret now served as a reminder of how far they had come. And the new photograph, with its honest arrangement and open acknowledgement of their true relationships, would serve as a beacon for other families struggling with similar secrets. Proof that it was possible to choose truth over comfort, love over convention, and authenticity over the approval of a society built on lies. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? What would you have done in Thomas's position? Remember, the most powerful stories are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to speak the truth. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and never be afraid to challenge the stories you've been told about your own life.